Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to a dialogue on advancing global cooperation for climate action, implementing the Paris Agreement. This is a webinar organized in collaboration with Environment Management Group. My name is Sobel Jafarzadeh, and I work for the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health. Today we have a very exciting expert panel joining us to discuss the synergies between different conventions and the COPs that we all have been working on in the environmental world. It's been a very busy time for environmentalists these few months, and we are very grateful for our panelists for making time to be with us today. With this, I would like to pass over the floor to Mr. Hossein Fadai, the head of the Secretariat of Environment Management Group, for him to give us an update on what went on at the Conference of the Parties at the Convention of Biological Diversity, what were the outcomes of UNEMG events, and how does he see the next steps towards the COP starting in Baku next week. Dear Hossein, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sobel. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. I hope that you can see and hear me well. Maybe not the best of the light. Okay, great. So thanks for this opportunity, Sobel, and great to see also the other colleagues. And I see that people are joining this conversation. So basically, as you said, we have been engaged in the last few weeks preparing a UN system for the triple COPs. Our main focus has been to bring this narrative and culture of interconnectivity of the agendas of these COPs, following especially the recent initiatives of the presidents of the Conference of the Parties of the three conventions, who brought this topic and the theme of Rio Trio as a notion to remind and to sort of recall the importance of the interconnectivity of the three agendas. So we have held a few activities during the COP, the recent COP in Cali. It was inclusive of heads of agencies dialogue, a cooperation day, UN pavilion, which again, all of them aim to bring a discussion as how do we make sure that in addressing the climate, biodiversity loss and pollution crisis, how can we work in an integrated manner. And so that was the main focus of the discussion. Obviously, we have witnessed, especially when looking at UN delivery on the ground, UN system, sort of cooperation framework agreements with countries. Most of the attention in terms of environmental integration has been on climate, whereas the other key environmental challenges that are drivers or also sometimes the derivatives of the climate change, they have been neglected. So the idea is to promote the understanding that we can actually address the delivery of the climate action agenda through integrated approaches by which the biodiversity, desertification, sustainable land management, and pollution-related issues can also be adequately and equally addressed. The challenge for us going to Baku next week with the similar types of activities, engaging again the UN system as our stakeholders in the environment management group, is again, to do the same thing, what are the various pathways of collaboration, coordination in the UN system at global, at the national level, by which we can, promote this synergistic approach towards implementation of the MEAs. And how would that can that happen in the area of climate change? So we would have to engage into that conversation. What would that mean to UN agencies in terms of delivering, supporting member states, delivering on their national commitments on all these MEAs? How can we help them as a UN system? And in that regard, what could be the specific role of the UN Environment Management Group? That's our main focus for Baku. And then we go from there to Riyadh, again with the same agenda. And I hope that this conversation today gives us some ideas. I know that it might not be specifically relating to UN, but it would be good to get some ideas, for example, at the country level, when we talk about these integrated approaches. What are the examples? What are the maybe thematic areas which are not directly environmental, but by focusing and investing in those areas, the objectives of the three conventions would be met. So if we would get some of those maybe examples would be great. And we would also set maybe as an example again for the UN agencies to form their programs, form their activities so that would contribute to the implementation of all MEAs together. If we believe that the financial resources, the capacities that are needed for implementation of all of the MEAs are not adequate at the national level, we have financing gaps, we have technological gaps, and and with the existing resources, realizing those objectives would not be possible. Then we will have to look into these integrated approaches, whole of a government approaches, whole of a society approaches, but we need also to define what would they concretely mean when it comes to preparing projects, programs for the UN system. So that's in essence what we want to focus today. I very much hope that the discussions today with the panelists would help us, and then I can take away from this some messages that we can also elaborate further on that at the Baku COP. Let me stop here, Sogol, and then pass it to you and the other colleagues for your panel discussion. Over. You're muted, or I cannot hear you.
Thank you for that. Sorry. Thank you for this great overview, Hussein. Some of us who have been working in the UN sphere for some time, we know that things tend to be siloed, and there's a lot of synergies, as you mentioned, or opportunities for collaboration that we could build on that sadly we don't always take advantage of. I've had a few messages that some of the colleagues have been having problems connecting. So we're working on that. But I also wanted to thank our participants now and to say it will be really great if you can start a thread on the Q&A session, and already before we get into discussion to introduce yourself, put your email, and let's have an engaging discussion. Moving forward, I want to go to a good colleague, Mr. Balakrishna Pisupati, who has recently been appointed the country head of the UN Environment Program in India. Dear Bala, it's a pleasure having you with us today. I know you have really extensive experience when it comes to multilateral environmental agreements and working on various different conventions, including the United Nations sort of the Climate Action Agreement. So if you can please I would like you to set the scene for us. I know you were very active at the CBD COP. So give us an overview. What were the main outcomes? What are the main synergies you see as we go into COP29 in Baku and COP16 in Riyadh? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sogol, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, for joining this conversation. And as both Sogol and Hussein mentioned, we are in a very pivotal moment, because if all of us remember vividly that when the environmental management governance issues started taking shape in the form of multilateral environmental agreements in Rio de Janeiro, we have seen three different conventions born at the same time. Certainly focusing on the critical issues that have been confronting us for many, many years. And the encouraging part is that after so many years of discussions, and as it was mentioned in a very siloed form, slowly it's very encouraging to see how it's just not the conventions or the secretariats of the conventions trying to come together and have a conversation, but the recognition by the member states and parties to these conventions also beginning to realize that more can be achieved if there are synergies. And certainly this more is very, very relevant the moment you're looking at implementation of the conventions at the national level, because essentially for a number of countries, it is one ministry, and perhaps in many countries, one department dealing with many of these issues at the same level. So what I'm going to do is to very quickly, provide you a bit of an overview of the key outcomes of the CBD COP. But then the context of these outcomes that I'm going to mention are relevant to the discussions that we are having today, which is the preparing of which is going to be the expectations or the agenda that is set for the countries as they are traveling to Baku, or they're getting ready to negotiate the next climate COP, the COP29 in Baku. Five very key decisions. This is not exhaustive list. These are five that are very relevant to the discussions on climate change. Of course, one discussion, which I'm sure many of you would have already picked up through various threads, has been the inconclusive discussions on financing or financial mechanism or the financial resources. And this, for various reasons, as you can understand, is on the top of agenda for the climate COP as well, both in the context of available finances for implementing and realizing the objectives of the convention and the Paris Agreement. But also remember, there are a number of finance-related discussions and decisions that needs to be taken at the Baku COP. Case in point is the operationalization of the loss and damage fund, for example. But for various reasons, unfortunately, there could not be any decision that could be taken at the Convention on Biodiversity COP on financial resources and the way countries need to work on it. But the expectation is that not having that particular agenda fulfilled will certainly have a kind of a spillover effect in the way negotiations are expected to happen in Baku. Because definitely it's going to be too difficult for countries to come out of Baku without a firm decision on financing. So that's going to be the first take in terms of the link between what's happening or what has happened in Kali and what is expected from Baku. And mind you, the discussions on finance is related not just on one element of the climate convention related issues of Paris Agreement, but it is spread across different elements of it. For example, on the whole work on adaptation, on the whole targets, or the whole raised level of ambitions that countries are expected to set when they are preparing the third issue or the third iteration of the nationally determined contributions, popularly called as NDC3. So that's the first package of issues. The second package of issues, which actually has a very, very important resonance across not just the two conventions, climate and biodiversity, but also on the land degradation convention, desertification convention, is the issue of scientific and technical cooperation. And this is going to be extremely important as countries are going to be meeting in Baku, because for the first time under the biodiversity convention, now we have formalized a lot of issues on how scientific and technical cooperation is going to happen. And for the first time in 30 plus years of the Convention on Biodiversity's existence, we have seen regional centers being established, regional institutions being mandated to work on scientific and technical cooperation and coordination. So certainly that element of the decision or the progress that countries are able to make in Kali will have some reflection given the discussions that will happen on technical and scientific cooperation. But certainly the focus of these discussions need to be it's not essentially that very visible, need to be on how to combine the scientific and technological interventions that can provide answers to the questions we have on biodiversity convention or conservation efforts, but also on climate change mitigation, adaptation, and the related aspects of it. The third agenda, which is very important coming out of the Cali COP, was the establishment of a subsidiary body on Article 8J, as it is called under the convention, that focuses on the issues of indigenous peoples and local communities. As you know, under the Convention on Climate Change also, there is a huge discussion on looking at local level actions, the participation of indigenous people, local communities, local level technologies, and a number of issues. And the big positive result of the Kali Biodiversity COP was the establishment of a full-fledged subsidiary body to discuss indigenous people, local communities, traditional knowledge, and the related issues. Certainly that will have certain resonance in terms of pushing that agenda, pushing those ideas forward under the climate COP. The next one is the issue related to marine and coastal biodiversity, a huge impact because colleagues, you also will remember now we have yet another international agreement that is to come into force fairly soon, which is the International Agreement on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction under the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. And the decisions that were taken in Cali, focusing on the issue of voluntary guidelines for ecosystem-based adaptation, the entire issue of disaster risk reduction, the supplementary guidelines on nature-based solutions, the joint work program of Rio, all of this under the context of coastal and marine biodiversity will also have some resonance in the way countries are expected to discuss some of these issues in Baku. The next point is the issue of biodiversity and health. Very progressive discussions in the biodiversity COP, expected to reflect positively in the Baku COP is also something very important. And the last 2 or 3 points I'd like to mention before I close are the following. One, the increased attention that the Kali COP received on not just looking at synergies between biodiversity conventions, but the requirement or the decision to enhance the coordination and cooperation across the Rio conventions, even though we have a mechanism, the joint liaison group working very well, but the idea to strengthen and to articulate the discussions under JLG to better serve the 3 conventions is something which is very important for the Baku COP. The second one is the consideration under the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. As countries are finalizing their national biodiversity strategies and as countries at the same time are also working on their third version of the nationally determined contributions, there cannot be a better opportunity for us to link climate change and biodiversity through some of these strategy documents. The last and important point is financing. And that's where the integrated financing comes into play a role. It is not about taking money from one pot and giving it to others, but it is on how do we intelligently deploy the available finances, because the need for using the money is the expanding, but the amount of money available, finances available are to an extent either getting stagnant or partially increasing. So integrated financing is already finding a place in the lexicon or in the discussions related to some of the conventions. And the expectation, given the outcomes of the Kali COP, is that the Baku will also have some focus on how do we actually look at some of the financial aspects of it in an integrated fashion. And lastly, all of it can only be done if there is policy alignment and policy coherence. And if there is one agenda that combines all the conventions working together and delivering at the national level, the focus should be on policy alignment and policy coherence, both vertically and horizontally. And these are some of the key feed in and reflect in the discussions in Baku. As I said, that this is not an exhaustive list or a comprehensive list, but it is just to give you a bit of a flavor of how things have come out, what has come out of Kali as countries prepare for Baku and then to Riyadh. Over to you, Sogol. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this, Vala. You touched on so many important points that it's really important for us, and I'm happy that we have Michael here today who also is taking note, and we can help the Environment Management Group hopefully summarize these and present them in their high-level roundtable, because there's so many different issues that we need to look at. And I think that this is quite what you ended mentioning, the policy coherence and alignment being important. I'm quite happy that we're now moving forward to speak to a good colleague and friend, Guy Bonvin. Guy, I'm putting you on the screen now. He is the Deputy Head of Mission and a Deputy Head of Regional Cooperation of the Swiss Embassy to the Republic of Azerbaijan and to Turkmenistan. Guy and I worked together quite closely when he was the Swiss water envoy to Central Asia. And I must say that as a Swiss national, I'm very proud that he's going to be part of the negotiations, and I have very high hopes for it now. Guy, thanks for joining us today. Can you reflect a little bit on what are Swiss priorities when it comes to these negotiations? What what common thread do you feel like? We both know the water world well. Do you think that could play a role of bringing the conventions together? And also just reflect a little bit on your work in the region and see if there are any specific projects or initiatives that you would like to highlight which which bring the synergies out of these different conventions and help countries in the region implement these frameworks a little bit better. Thank you, and over to you, Guy.
Yes, thank you, Sogol. Thank you. Good evening to all of you. I say good evening because I'm the one in most advanced of the part of the day here. Good morning, good afternoon for others. So yes, I mean, here the question is actually extremely interesting. And in that regard, Switzerland is always trying to push to as a first priority integrated action to make it advance in synergies across all these multilateral arrangements for agreements for environment. This is, of course, talking about all the Rio Conventions, definitively, and also trying to put together the agenda of climate, biodiversity, lands, and not to mention also water, because that's my background here. And interconnection is clearly based on scientific arguments, scientific-based framework, trying to align all the questions. And here, of course, the tentative to have silo thinking is quite high, and this the willingness of Switzerland to address this coherence and efficiency in implementation. It was been pointed on the financing, and financing, of course, and I'm coming from the economic department, the efficiency of using financial resources, of course, about integration and not duplicating everything. So, of course, Switzerland is also known to the collaboration in the multilateral context and trying to put all the initiatives all together. And this is why, for instance, we are also advocating for in the international Geneva of our support of the environment management group in this sense of very much of consistency and coherence. As I said before, I'm coming from the water angle, about water and energy angle also, and the link it is across the Rio Conventions, because actually most of the impact of the climate change is done on the water cycle, through the water cycle, and changing the water cycle. And as water is, of course, very much linked with the life and biodiversity, and it is actually allow me this image, but the fuel of life. This is why we have this very close connection. And integrated water management is, of course, a bridge across the UNCCD, which is the combating the desertification, so water scarcity, but also of the climate change UNFCCC, which is, of course, too much and too little water, and convention, as I say, on biodiversity is also an important one. And the impact, okay, we have in the background the city of Baku, but this is the background is important, not only the watershed, but one subject I like very much is also this transboundary water issue, because climate change and biodiversity is by no means limited by a political border, and is by no means limited by geographical border. So that's why I think it's important and trying to address all these vulnerabilities in terms of climate, in terms of biodiversity, and in terms of desertification. So, well, again, water management is a very good illustration. And I think if you look all the SDG architecture is really one of the key elements you find in every part of the conventions and every discussion. So it is definitely an argument that should be addressed. Now, if we are looking also very much on what we are doing in the region, and the region I encompass, of course, Central Asia also, which is not only Caucasus. I mean, here we are exactly at the interface between the two. Is of course the role of water, the role of women in water diplomacy, which is also a key element, and we try to push to advocate for sustainable practices. So, of course, in the negotiation team here, we will be involved in the financing aspect, which is a key element, and financing. It was mentioned before, Cali was a big topic. It will be again a big topic here, and I think we have also some important delegation and scientific member also from instance, Geneva University will also make the connection with the next session in Riyadh under this One Water Summit, which is definitively connecting all the dots on that aspect. What we are doing here in the region, I mentioned the Blue Peace Initiative, which is definitely a diplomatic water diplomacy initiative. I was very much involved in my previous capacity here, and it's a way definitely to put all key actors on the table, dealing with the environment, dealing with the finance, dealing also with energy, and also trade. I mean, this is just a very big connections to different aspects. So it's not only environment, and it's also an attempt to turn the environment challenges as an opportunity. And then talking as maybe as somebody coming from the Ministry of Economy is to look for the opportunities, not only a constraint. And I think it is important here to look at that. And if I look the whole UN architecture, it's to take it as an opportunity to be all together instead of thinking in each of the pieces of the system. So my wish again here in the light of what is coming here in Baku is, of course, we are focusing on the UNFCCC, but there is something upstream, which is Cali. There's something which is downstream, which is Riyadh, and there is also to my opinion, to advocate for this financing, I would say, efficient use of funding, which is not only concerning UNFCCC, but is also concerning the water issues, concerning the local communities, concerning, of course, the women, and all what we can put under one roof, or we are all in the same boat. So with that, I would like to close my intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Guy, for this very informative presentation. I'm so happy that you brought up financing again, as did Bala, and it makes me wonder really, can we afford not to have an integrated approach at this point, at the point that many of us are struggling with financing, with donors are cutting more and more, and the world has more and more needs. We really have to be smarter in our planning, to work better together, and to build on the synergies and leverage the resources we have. So that was a very good point. Another thing I'm taking away was the water reference to the COPs. So upstream we had Cali and downstream we have Riyadh. I wonder how they both feel about this. But this was a very good introduction also to the region that our next speaker is going to speak about. So thank you for being with us. Please do stay for the panel discussion. Sylvie, are you here with us?
I am. I'm here. I'm listening.
Hi. Thanks for being here. Ms. Sylvie Goyer is the Deputy Coordinator and the Head of Environmental Activities of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, an organization that I personally know very well. And I also know that they do work in quite an integrated manner, a bit different from other organizations. So, Sylvie, can you let us know what do you see as how does an international organization or intergovernmental organization like OSCE help governments with integrated approaches when it comes to multilateral environmental agreements? And how can we make sure that we're not competing over interests, but actually helping the governments move forward and report simultaneously on these issues? We hear more and more these days that there's a gap between sort of the global policy making and local level. How do you see that in your work? OSCE does support quite a lot of local communities. And also, you are an experienced climate change negotiator yourself. So I just wonder if you can share some of your personal thoughts. What would be your wishes? What would you like to see at the COP in Baku? With this, I give you the screen. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sogol. Very happy to be on the panel. Thanks for getting me in, and a very good morning or afternoon to you all. These are easy questions indeed, and I'll try and address some of these questions and giving you elements. First, let me remind everyone that from the onset, the three conventions were meant as interconnected, right? The challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, and desertification were meant as interconnected challenges. And as Hossein reminded us just now, there's been numerous, how should I say, decisions and policy documents really reminding us of the linkages, of the interconnectedness. So we're not short of a justification for that. Now, second is one has to acknowledge, and from a practitioner point of view, that even though we have the mandate to work together, and there's been numerous policy decisions and document, and just now in Cali, as Palakrishna just reminded us, to point to the synergies, there hasn't been much in practice. And before I move to some of your key questions, my third point is to highlight the risk of not having more linkages. And I'm not going to go into, in practice, how it's not working. We all know that, different secretariat, different COPs, and we're jumping from one COP to another, different scientific reporting and all this. Now, the risk of not going more with an integrated approach. First is to completely or incompletely identify and understand the connections between biodiversity loss and climate. We sense it, but to identify it and to understand it is another thing. Second is the risk of overlooking the compounding effects of each of these challenges. And that gets us to the tipping point approach. I mean, some of the compounding effects, the sum of the parts is bigger than the individual parts, is that type of reasoning. So we're missing probably the compounding effects that's happening. And third is actually the risk of taking action on one convention that may threaten achieving outcomes in another convention. So the risks are huge. Now, my fourth point is to identify that indeed there are some encouraging moves, and you and the speakers have already identified quite a few items that give us optimism that we're moving in the right direction. First, I'd like to remind that I think, in my opinion, we got a big push with the IPCC IPBES workshop of 2021 and the workshop that came out. I think that joint workshop was quite instrumental, is coming up with this at least scientific baseline and scientific understanding that we have to work together. Second, I'd say it's the reality of climate change impacts, and we have seen, and people have seen, on the ground, how, loss of biodiversity exacerbates some of the climate impacts. And third, and Guy and yourself phrased it nicely, we cannot afford from a financial basis to not go with an integrated approach. We just don't have the finance. The amounts we're talking about are huge. The best way to cope with that, instead of each of us fighting for different streams of funding, is to focus on those priority areas that will give us an integrated approach and will give us multiple impacts across the 3 conventions. So as you rightly mentioned, Sogol, that's a very powerful argument for us to move forward. And probably that's the best one at the moment because the finance is so limited. Now, Hossein asked for some examples. So he said, what examples? How can we promote this synergetic approach? What thematic areas? So I have 3, and I'd like to just bring that up. First, I think, and it's obvious to many of us, in the field of nature-based solutions, to me, that's a key cross-cutting across all of the conventions. We know that, I'm not going to go into the definition, but that refers to, the protection of coral reefs and mangroves for protecting coastal communities from flooding and storms and all this. That refers to the protection of wetlands, again for water management. Nature-based solutions, I believe, would be a key win across all of the conventions. And here, because I'm a big fan of the ocean, and Guy mentioned that was a key outcome of the Cali COP16, I do believe that ocean actions and decisions could be key, could be a very nice entry point. We've been having ocean days at UNFCCC COPs for the past few years. We've had an ocean decision at COP25 in Madrid. We've had increased ocean action in Cali, to the point that some referred to it as the CBD blue COP or something like this. So I think ocean is a nice hook for us to get in. The second thematic area to me would be the whole work on renewable energy technologies. We at OSCE, we're very much pushing on that area, and I'll come back to that in a second. But the whole area of clean and sustainable technologies, renewable energy in particular, I think we know that those are key in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also key in reducing the pressure on land, on forests and all this. So I think that's another key hook and key entry point. And the third one, I would say, and that links up to your question about the link between global and local. The third thematic area, in my opinion, is local communities, indigenous people. The push in the global biodiversity framework, the push in Cali, as Palakrishna referred to earlier, to have a dedicated body to this. I do believe that empowering local communities, indigenous communities, would be a key hook, again, to promote integrated approach. Now, I would think that we're not there yet on the UNFCCC COP. We have made progress with the UNCCD, and CBD definitely was a breakthrough since Montreal. So I think that's, to me, the third hook, if I may, to this, areas where really integrated synergetic approach could be undertaken. Now, you asked me about what is the OSCE doing in that area. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the whole background of the OSCE. It's a large security organization with a comprehensive approach to security. You know that. But we're taking, indeed, through our environmental activities, we are pushing for integrated approaches along those lines. To be more efficient, and again, finance here is an issue. It's an issue as well in terms of the the counterparts that we have in the countries. I mean, it doesn't make sense anymore to have 3-4 different workshops addressing the different conventions. So we're trying to, bring the stakeholders together. And let me flag here a series of workshops that we've done in Central Asia called Drops of the Future on the nexus between water, energy, and food security in a changing climate. And I'd like to thank here my colleague from Switzerland. He mentioned Blue Peace Initiative that was supported, that is being supported by Switzerland. Thanks a lot for that. But again, this is a good example of the kind of nexus that we're trying to do, bringing in youth and women and really bringing the nexus together, the nexus approach. It's often more difficult to carry out, but it's more effective in terms of, I would say, cost benefit. Let me give another example that I think, and you ask about, the disconnect between global and local understanding. I think, I don't know what the other speakers believe, but I believe that maybe I'm a big fan of multilateral approach. Let's be very clear about this. But we've had quite a bit already. We have the conventions, we have the objectives, they're clear. We have the targets, again, they're pretty clear now. How much more do we need to go on those multilateral conventions? How many more COPs? On a cost benefit analysis, all these COPs, I would question the numbers. So maybe now we have quite a good framework at the global level. Of course, it needs, regular and recurrent reminder and monitoring. But I would believe now we need to move to the local level. That's where the action takes place. And I would wish that we do focus a bit more on, for example, we've talked about local communities, but also local authorities. I'm very heartened to see some of the move on that front of the past year or so. At UN Ocean Conference next year in Nice, UNOC in 2025, in June 2025, there's going to be, sorry, I'm not going to be there, a big summit on cities. It's called Ocean Rise and Coastal Resilience Coalition. So it's a focus on cities. Cities are getting empowered. They're basically putting forward, look, we're at the front line of climate change or biodiversity loss. Let's, put our acts together. Let's, demonstrate that it is at that level that it matters. And I do believe that. So this is happening. I think there is a push to cities coming forward. As you know, IPCC is coming up with a special report on climate and cities in 2027. To me, that's another indicator that we are giving credit to the work being done at the local level. Cities in particular, I do believe, is a very strong angle. Cities and regions at the level of ocean, the regional seas is something I cherish very much. So I think there's, all these efforts happening. Let me conclude. We've just mentioned, I've just mentioned earlier, the Nexus Water, Food, Energy, and the Drops of the Future initiative that OSCE is doing. We're doing a lot of work as well in between communities. For example, between Azerbaijan and Georgia on fire management, just bringing communities together and addressing the solution. Of course, fire management impacts upon climate change and climate adaptation, but it's also a very strong a drive for biodiversity. So I just wanted to flag this example as well. If I have 2 seconds, I'll just say that, and you ask me, what do I expect from Baku in 2 seconds? I'd say, well, to me, this integration and the synergies have to come A, from the implementers, and B, from finance. I think Baku has to work on finance, and we know they're going to be working on finance. We need to make sure that the negotiators include very practical synergies across the MEAs in the decisions, policy documents, on finance coming out of COP29. And we need to encourage the financing mechanism like the GCF, the GEF, but also the bilaterals, EKI and the UK and all this, to really ensure that the integration principles are in there whenever they allocate resources. I hope I wasn't too long, but you had quite a few questions. Thank you very much, Sogol.
Thank you so much for this very comprehensive, but also quite personal sort of intervention and statement. We can see when you speak, Sylvie, that you really care for these issues, and which tells me that you are were really the right person for this panel. So thank you for your attention and the care you put into this detailed answers. And I'm so happy that this is now being recorded, because it almost feels like a lecture to me that could be listened to over and over again. You raise many good points. Again, we see finance coming up. I'm happy you brought up Indigenous peoples as well. The UNU-INWEH is based in Canada, and in line with the priorities of the government of Canada, that's an issue that we pay a lot of attention to these days. Another thing that you brought up was the Drops of the Future, which also it's an initiative I know very well. They do several joint programs at times with the Women in Water Diplomacy Network as well, which I'm part of. But coming to, I really like the sort of the concrete, when you brought the water, energy, some now say environment, food, plus ecosystem and health nexus, because that's really an integrated approach that is advancing quite a bit. And it's one of the, we had a presentation on it in our last webinar, showing how actually the WEF Plus Nexus could use as a good mechanism for reporting at national level, to help governments not have all these different focal points for conventions, but actually help them look at a systems thinking mechanism and report on biodiversity, climate change, and different issues. So thank you so much for this. Please stay with us and come back for the panel discussion. But I will now move on to another good colleague who has joined us, agreed to join us today, Mr. Guy Brucke. And I do see the irony that we have two Guys today on the panel. He's the program specialist at the UNESCO Regional Office for Southern Africa, here based in Harare, Zimbabwe, the same as me. And Guy, I think you're actually the best person to now come in and talk to us a little bit more about national level. So local level, how do you see the bottom-up approach? Has it been successful so far? And what could UN agencies do better at the country level to work together for the government to support the member states in reporting on these MEAs and the targets? Over to you, Guy. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Sogol. Thank you for having me, and good evening from Harare. As you pointed out, my perspective is very much limited to the, I would call it the micro level. It's with working with member states on the ground. I've never been to a COP, but I've spent more than 30 years working with different member states, and I do see things evolving. Maybe the first point I could make is and I heard the word lecture, so I'll try not to do that. Is to point out that indeed there's nothing new about talking about integrated work. In Rio with the Agenda 21 and the 3 conventions, everyone talked about working in a more integrated manner. We remember IWRM, integrated water resources management, integrated rural development, integrated urban management, and so on. So I think we somehow lost the forest a bit among the trees since then. And I'm talking again as someone who works on the ground. And I know the reason. The UN system needed to justify funding and political support, so we created indicators and goals MDGs and SDGs, which is great. We can measure what we do, but it seems to me that by promoting these, these 17 colored boxes with thick walls, we have unwittingly sent a message to return to a sectoral or a reductionist approach. All the water people go to room 6, all the climate people go to room 13, which was of course not the intention, but I can see that development happening on the ground. And also with the conventions. I remember a few weeks ago, I spoke to some young people from government and NGOs, and we discussed wetlands, and I mentioned adaptation. And a person replied, "Oh, I only work on biodiversity." And I thought, okay, that's strange. So climate change is different colleagues, and desertification is yet another person. Sometimes, as the previous speakers pointed out, sometimes it's just the same person. That's true, and more a question of capacity. So yeah, so I wanted to start with that it is a little bit ironic in a way that integration is high on the agenda again, but it's also a good sign for me, and it's the right sign. So in my work, which you asked about, I look at integration, but I also look at the second aspect that has somewhat been lost, in my opinion, which I would call it localization. And I'm happy also that Sylvie talked about the need to get there. I guess you've scheduled us very well. We now talk about localizing the SDGs, but of course there was a local Agenda 21 chapter 30 plus years ago. The whole thing, think globally, act locally, in a town, in a district, in an integrated, coordinated way, so not sectorally. And somehow I feel it also got lost a little bit. So there have been initiatives, mainly in cities, in industrialized countries, but there hasn't really been a strong global movement of local Agenda 21. And certainly not in Africa, where I've mainly worked for 30 years. But there are initiatives we can build on, and to answer your question on ideas and so on. I work for UNESCO, so that's where my experience lies. But of course, we work with many partners, including the member states, in places that countries nominate as biosphere reserves. And biosphere reserves had precisely that purpose, to demonstrate sustainable development at the level of a landscape, including transboundary biosphere reserves. There are now nearly 750 or so in the world, so it's not a small club. And to give you an idea, and this is also how we met, I think, in Southern Africa, we work on conservation, community resilience, and adaptation in the same sites with the same people. So not to go into detail, but we basically combine using modern scientific tools that we make available, things like remote sensing, satellite imagery, flood, drought, landslide risk mapping, and we combine that with local knowledge to jointly plan and implement adaptation actions. So that this would probably for you be linked to climate. For me, it's just working in a landscape, and the biodiversity activities are other activities. We've started a project on water funds, which is a different angle, which is finding a way for communities, the same communities, to negotiate for keeping upstream water resources functional. So the downstream users are convinced to pay for this. A few other things, we support citizen science in the same landscape and community monitoring. Of course, for many Western countries, this is now quite common. You walk in the street, you see a burst pipe or a crack in a bridge, you take a photo and you upload it to your municipality. But here in Africa, it doesn't really exist, and there's an opportunity to do that. And the point of this is that you can come in from very different angles and improve the governance at local level. And that's the whole idea that I would like to try to defend. Just imagine in a rural area, the water extension officer comes maybe once a month. So if citizens can pre-warn the person with pictures and GPS coordinates, a technician can plan his or her visit much more effectively. So this is just an example of what I work on, but I'm sure many organizations and people do similar things, including probably many people in the audience. So what I would plead for, and when you ask for ideas, is that we should not forget this. And I'm glad that previous speakers already talked about it. Working in an integrated way at local level. And I think small is still beautiful, if you allow me. And I'm really very grateful that so many people invest their life, I would say, in convincing world leaders to change their policies, negotiating difficult negotiations to rescue the only planet we have. But UN agencies and others could also work together locally to demonstrate what an integrated approach can really do in one landscape. So I had a thought is, we are getting together at the COPs, so why don't we get together in a landscape? That's an invitation. So thank you very much. Let me stop here.
Thank you so much, Deirdre, for sharing your perspective with us. For me, UNESCO is quite unique as it's one of the only agencies that really puts people and planet together in an integrated way. And as you mentioned, really in a local area. So I think that's actually it was a very good place to end now. And if I may ask also our other panelists to when they're ready, join us on this side of the room, but to discuss a little bit more. So we have a few questions that came in, but I wonder if we can discuss, first of all, a little bit more about this idea of meeting in landscapes and looking at just sort of the problems we're dealing with, because a lot of times also in these situations, I was very happy to see all the reports coming out of Cali were saying that this was really a people's COP. But previously, people did not have that impression that it wasn't a people's COP. It was mostly just experts coming and discussing a specific agreement without taking into account the people who have to manage the land or the people who will suffer the consequences of certain political decisions. So I'm very, very happy that you highlighted that bit, as well as going to COPs. Also, it's another thing working on climate change. We do need to consider now what are the costs of such big conferences these days. And do we need that, or we just need more local action? We all need to do a little bit better where we're sitting rather than getting in planes and meeting in thousands in different parts of the world. So thank you for bringing that up. This was my perspective. I hope it didn't reflect in a politically wrong way on what you said. But again, so I wonder now, I have apologies from another speaker. We had Natalie, who is a youth negotiator going to Baku. And sadly today she was in rural Zimbabwe, and we did many tests and just the internet was not good enough. So I promised her that we will later on include her statement in the recording. I see many wonderful young people online, university students, the ones who have introduced themselves. If you can add your questions, that would be wonderful. And if I can also ask our other panelists, I don't know if you hear me, if you can join me, please turn on your cameras and I can bring you to this side. But a specific question that has come up is actually about information. How can we trust information that we hear? How can we share better information? I assume now more and more with the political landscape that we are entering, this will become an issue. Where do we find good science? How do we make sure that the information we have is actually what we should be using to implement at local level? I wonder, Bala, I think that you could be a good person to start on this. May I give it over to you?
Thank you. I'd only like to say that there is nothing called good science or bad science, but it is relevant science. That's why many times we say that science never lies, but it just learns over a period of time. So just a point on that. Remember, actually, it's just not about information, because many of these processes, many of these decisions and multilateral negotiations, to an extent, the information coming out or the information getting into some of these discussions are fairly robust. I mean, there is a lot of checks and balances. There is a lot of discussion at all. It is more the interpretation of that information. It is the more in terms of how people use that information in terms of, pushing some agenda, filtering some elements of the agenda and things like that. That is where sometimes we have a bit of an issue. So if I'm going to be looking at the question saying that how do we trust the information, I am assuming that the information is split into two parts of it: information that goes into making a decision and the information that actually informs the process of making that decision. The information that goes into your decision is a valid question, because as many of us do understand, a lot of assessments do happen. And in fact, if Hussein is on the call, we were together in Bonn when we convened a meeting of the scientific panels and the MEAs, where the discussion was on how do we strengthen the science policy interface. And very clearly, one message that came out of it is that in spite of great work, credible work that gets done from these assessments and from these panels, the biggest gap, and that's what I'm looking at the information here on what feeds into the decision-making process, is many times the science or the information that is based on science of it, there is still a lack of flow of information that goes from the south, from the developing countries. And that was something which was very clearly acknowledged, because even though the assessments take the published reports, the peer-reviewed reports, the scientific publications and all of it, a large part of that scientific information is something either is generated or based on the assessments that gets in the Western world. So one definite concern that was discussed in that meeting was that how do we empower, how do we increase the science that is relevant for these countries in the developing country category or countries in the southern hemisphere, but how does it get reflected also in the assessments, so that some of these assessments are truly representational in terms of the options available for these countries when the decisions are being made. So certainly it's a kind of a question that is very difficult to have a direct answer, but it all depends on how careful we are in terms of capturing that information, making that information that comes as representational as possible from different stakeholder groups. That is where this subsidiary body that was established at the Kali COP, focusing on Article 8J, is something which we expect to fill that gap to an extent on some of these issues. Thank you, Sobal. Over.
Thank you, Bala. That's actually very valuable. And you are so right that also, I think as the UN system, and this is something we do at UNU-INWEH quite a lot, that our main mandate is bridging the science policy gap. But how can we make the information needed available? So countries from the global south actually attend these meetings well informed, and they can decide what is the good outcome for their setup, for their local needs. And that's something that we do have to work more on. I now work more and more on research as well in Africa, and realize that even the methodology has not been adapted to the local needs. So we do need to help countries, to capacitate them to work on these issues, and to have, for example, we say it quite a bit in a initiative we have on African Academy for Water, Environment and Health, is to have African solutions for Africa. But I would like to now go to Guy and see what are his views. What do you think the UN system or the scientific community could do better for a person like you, for you to be better informed going into the negotiations and have the information you need?
Which Guy?
Yvonne Bam. We established you don't go to COPs. The geese sitting in Baku, please.
Okay, the one to Baku. I mean, information, you mean scientific information, this type of information. Well, being myself an engineer, I'm maybe not the best person to answer because I tend to myself look for that information. But it is true that I support fully what you are saying before. I mean, that facts are facts, but this is the interpretation of those facts which are making the challenge. And here also, if I refer to the experience we had in Central Asia before, and then mostly for water, but is the remote sensing is a good way to address the things and to avoid all these I would say interest of biasing information in a way or another. This is one thing. The other thing, okay, we are pointing out scientific information, and of course they are, especially in a region like we are here, not easy to have reliable data available. Or the other point is, I would like to make also the connection with the political economy analysis, because this has also a huge influence on the way you interpret, presence, the information, and it could be at the national level, but it could be very much at the local level, and it could be also at the city level for various information. And I think here, I used to say in my previous job that the water diplomat is a mixture of engineer, lawyer, ethnologue, sociologue, politologue, and of course biodiversity and so on and so forth. And I think this is also a way to make the information circulating, build up a team, and the same is valid at different scale. I mean, I was very much also involved in urban development. So you can make the same reflection at the level of a city, of a community, or at the national level. And I think the questions are pretty much the same. And at the end of the day, the risk to detail the information must be very carefully looked at in considering the various interests on the table. And it could be on the, of course, water itself, climate issues, but also things like real estate or different things like that. And I think here we are in countries where those questions are very much challenged, but not only here. I mean, also in countries like my own country at home, it's not always obvious to have reliable information on the table. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I see that I was so mesmerized and all of you speaking that actually I did not do a very good job as a moderator, and we're a little bit over time. So in that interest, Sylvie, can we come to you now? Tell me, how do you use, you can reflect either on information or data, and tell us how do you use it in your work to make sure that these synergies are met? Could actually remote sensing or data be one of the entry points into a more integrated approach?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sogol. Just to build up on the good points of my colleagues, indeed, to me, in addition to the gap in terms of developing countries' information, I think there's a big gap in downscaling information to the appropriate level. For example, at OSCE, we're working on mitigating impacts on energy systems from climate change, and we're doing this in Central Asia, and we're finding out that the modeling doesn't exist at this scale. So there is a lot of work to be done to downscale some of the climate models to the appropriate level. The second point I'd like to mention is increasingly industries or businesses or different sectors of the economy are looking for this data. Energy is a case of point, in point, of course. They want to have the appropriate data so that they can safeguard their systems and their infrastructure to climate change impact. So the industry is ready to invest in some of this. Insurance is another case in point. I mean, they're doing a lot of work on this, on getting the appropriate information so that they can build that in their own systems as well, because of course it's critical for them. So I think we may have to look more in terms of information, in terms of linking up with some of these private actors and seeing how we can, jointly work together on information. We have the similar objectives, let alone in different ways. So that's just those 2 points I wanted to flag. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sylvie, for your reflection on this. Can I go back to Guy and Harare, please? And I'm actually wondering, in your context, do you mentioned civilian science, so what you do when with the gathered information, and if you work in that research space to help communities locally. But I also, if you have any reflections on the issue of insurance, as we're more and more talking about this loss and damages related to climate change, is that something that you use as a local tool? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe on the citizen science question. So we, until now, I would say we've mainly used it for capacity building purposes. So people get involved in water monitoring, environmental monitoring, and then it's UNESCO is also education. So we see it as that tool. It's only this year that we're really trying to shift towards the governance aspect. And that also means that people have to understand what the data they collect means in terms of providing information. And I have to say, when I started these projects, I was a bit apprehensive because I thought, we are engineers, scientists, and so on, and you go to a community and you're going to talk about climate models and hydrological models, which floods and so on. But actually, communities cope quite well with that. Of course, you work through intermediaries, people who do the actual talking and so on, and that actually works quite well. So that is understanding. For me, that's one point, is of course understanding the information, and I've been usually very positively impressed of the capacity of people. The other thing for us is accurate information and so on, and the question made me think of a slightly different topic, which is early warning systems. And we had an experience, and I'll be very honest about it, where we had a post-cyclone reconstruction project, and we received support to install an early warning system. We installed a community radio locally, and then we worked on an early warning system using satellite imagery and so on. And we then realized that that's not enough. Then you have 2 dots, and how do you connect them? So it's a lesson learned that it didn't work. Because then you need a whole chain of decision making. Who gives what information to whom? Because there is a major policy issue in getting the wrong information. So it's actually much more complex than that. So that's for our next attempt, because we're also learning. So maybe that's as a reaction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is a point that I will make sure actually to bring up at our webinar next week. I know it's late, especially for Guy and Baku, so I will not keep you longer. The time of the webinar is over. I want to thank our wonderful panelists for your interventions, for all this wealth of knowledge that you shared with us today. I am very personally grateful, but also thank you from my institute, UNU-INWEH, for being with us. This will go online. We will prepare the report, hand it over to AMG for them to share at COP29, and hope to be able to keep in touch with you all. Thank you also to all the participants who joined in. With that, have a great evening and afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sogol. Thank you.